Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today we're going to be updating our tier list because it has been 2 weeks since our last one, as well as we did have new limit restrictions announced which have been put into effect in tournaments, so we have had sort of a meta shake-up. So previously we did have Light Galaxy and Red Boot as the two decks that were winning the most tournaments. They were the most dominant and both very powerful OTK decks. Then we had sort of a bit of a control-ish strategy from the Spellcasters. We had Heroes, which was sort of an OTK strategy, and then another OTK strategy in Dark Galaxy tier thing. That was our original tiers 1, 2, and 3. Now, since then, we have had a little bit of a shake-up, but not anything too drastic. Everything below this black line are tournaments that have taken place since the new limit restrictions have been put into place, and we have only had 4 of those, so we do only have a very small sample size of the new current meta, but the meta didn't change in a huge way, so I don't think it matters too much. We did get to see Baseball taking its first tournament win, and most recently, Elemental Hero has also claimed a win. If we go down and take a look at our top 4 points pie chart, we can see Light Galaxy still overwhelmingly dominant in the meta. Red Boot is still hanging in there, even though it hasn't really done a lot recently. Elemental Heroes has been on the rise. Then we've got Spellcasters, Baseball is now here, and Tearfing both making their ways into the top 4 finishes. So the one thing to take note of is Red Boot hasn't been performing that well. It did really well at the start, and with the new limit restricted list, if anything it got a buff because Phoenix Dragon did go from 1 to 2, which means you can now play that in the deck, which is actually sort of a buff. Now, I don't think you necessarily need Phoenix Dragon in that deck, and in some ways I think it's actually not very good in the deck, but if anything it got buffed rather than nerfed. So it is interesting to see that the deck has been slipping. But this doesn't necessarily paint the whole picture, so we'll move over to the side here, and these are only tournament results from the tournaments that have been using the new limit restricted list, and as we can see, Light Galaxy has won 2 of them, Baseball and Hero have won 1, and Red Boot is kind of nowhere to be seen. So Red Boot has, I think, been let down a little bit. I'm not really sure why this has specifically happened, but Red Boot does seem to be on the decline. It's still a very powerful OTK tool. You're still able to burn your opponent for like 3,100 damage quite easily, and then attack over their monsters for a lot of damage. You can use things like Stop Defense or Curse or Flap Dragon to flip the monsters into attack position to attack over them with that really powerful enhanced Red Boot Dragon. The issue I think this deck has is if you don't find that Red Boot, if you don't pretty much open it in the opening hand, the deck doesn't really do a lot and it can start to struggle. So I think players have been favoring some of the other decks that do feel a little bit more consistent. I still think this deck is a really powerful deck, but in tournament play, it feels like it's maybe just not as consistent as it needs to be. So I think we are going to be dropping Red Boot down to tier 3. As for Light Galaxy, this deck hasn't really changed. It's still the same deck it's always been. It's still really powerful. It's still able to do exactly what it's always done, right? We're able to summon out the Eternal Galactic Oblivion, we're able to give it Piercing, we're able to get its attack to be ridiculously high, we're able to go into Plasma to pop your opponent's back row, we have Plora, which just gives us so much control, it can turn on our skill, it gives us access to Fusion again if we want to do any kind of big combo plays. There's just so much this deck can do, and it has so few weaknesses that it is no surprise that this deck is still the best deck in the game. And I think it is now in a tier of its own. It arguably was already, but again, initially we did see Red Boot actually performing quite well and putting up good numbers, but that does seem to have fallen off a bit. So I do think Light Galaxy is the only tier 1 deck in the game right now. Going back to our data, we can see that Spellcasters is another deck it's still around, it's still getting some top 8 finishes, but it's really fallen off. It was a very dominant force in the meta, but has recently, like we say, it's sort of fallen off. It's just not as competent as it was. Again, if we go back to the overall data, it's still hanging in there, but even overall, it's only 6.1% with only 10 top 4 finishes, which unfortunately I just don't think is enough. So I do think we are going to be moving this down to tier 3 as well. This deck is still good at what it does. It's still able to quite consistently use its game plan. We just need to find one of 9 different cards in the deck to activate the skill. The skill is a 3+1 that can also set up the graveyard. You can go into something like Strange Witch, which gets you back your Seven's Road Witch. Then you can go into the fusion of Charmy. Charmy is just a really good boss monster, being able to get a lot of damage in. The issue this deck has is a lot of the field right now are all OTK decks. They're all decks that are going to try and kill you in a single turn. Spellcasters can kill you in a single turn, but do struggle to do it somewhat. So I think they are falling behind a little bit in the tournament metagame. So I think they have slipped down to tier 3. Still a strong deck, still has a lot of power behind it. It's just in OTK meta, you want to be playing OTK decks. And I think this deck just doesn't do that. Next up, we'll take a look at Elemental Heroes. And Elemental Heroes has been doing okay, but hasn't been like super dominant. It does have a tournament win, so that is something. The deck has been performing at an okay level, and if again we take a look at the overall stats, it is arguably the third best deck still. 12.1% is a sizable chunk of this chart, and like we said, Red Boot got a lot of its points very, very early on in the meta before things were necessarily solved. E-Hero is now starting to pick up the points now, so I would say E-Hero is doing a lot better than Red Boot right now. I think tier 2 is a solid spot for it. I don't think it needs to really go anywhere else. This deck is a little bit inconsistent, but does have a lot of tools to fix that. So the issue this deck has is the skill doesn't really do enough. The skill basically just gives you fusion all the time, which is nice, but fusion on its own doesn't get a whole combo going, right? So what the deck now has is cards like Amazing Dealer. We have cards like Elemental Circulation, which can turbo through your deck to find the correct pieces to get everything going. But once everything does get going, the deck can be very scary. We're able to make Flame Wingman, we can fuse Flame Wingman into Shining Flare, we can use Miracle Fusion to make a second Shining Flare, and that is where this deck really gets powerful. Summoning out 2 Shining Flare Wingmans is such a ridiculously powerful play, it's just not going to happen too often unless we find all of our consistency tools. The other thing this deck does is it has access to Burst Wingman, which is really good to, one, build a decent board, as well as pop your opponent's back row, which can be really, really important. But this deck can struggle a little bit into set monsters, and we have started to see players come up with different ways to deal with this. Some people have been playing Curse, some people have been playing Stop Defense, some people have been playing Piercing Samurai, but you are going to need something to get over defensive monsters, otherwise this deck is kind of going to run into your opponent's defensive position monsters and then not do much else. But this deck is still really strong and a solid tier 2. So next up, we'll take a look at Dark Galaxy tier thing. So this deck has actually had 3 top 4 finishes, which is very good. It hasn't won a tournament yet, but it's still very powerful. The deck is very simple to play. You don't really play many spell traps. Usually you just play like 1 or 2. The deck is very powerful. It's able to just OTK your opponent out of nowhere. I think I am going to be bumping this up to a tier 2 deck. Now, this might be a little bit premature. Maybe like the meta is still a little bit too fresh. Maybe this deck's just been getting a little bit lucky, but I do think this deck has legs. I did think this last time we made the tier list as well. This deck can, again, just kill your opponent out of nowhere. The only real good way to play around this outside of just having a good trap is to play 1 monster in defense, because then your opponent won't be able to activate the Chrysaor's effect to be able to attack multiple times. But if you do that and your opponent just summons 3 monsters, for example, gets piercing on those monsters, you could just die anyway. So this deck is a little bit high roll, but still very, very powerful. And I don't think this deck should be underestimated. I think this deck is a little bit slept on, and people really do underestimate it, but this deck is actually quite strong. It's maybe not quite on the same power level as Hero, but I do think it is a little bit better than the decks beneath it, so I am going to leave it in tier 2 for now. And then the other big deck that's kind of come out of nowhere is Baseball. So Baseball is a really cool deck. I really like this deck. I like the way the deck plays. It did see a little bit of success prior to the balance changes, and you have to give it credit for that. We were seeing kind of a trap-heavy build, and this deck was doing okay and kind of playing a control baseball kind of strategy. But since the limit restricted list, we have had Phoenix Dragon put to 2. That means there are 2 more dragons to go into this deck. That means we have another tool to get the Grounder back from the graveyard, but more importantly, this now does better enable the Dragonic Pressure version of this deck. So Pressure is something that I was experimenting a little bit when this deck came out, but I came to the conclusion we didn't really have enough dragons, because you still have to open a bunch of dragons to get this to work. You can use the skill to grab 2 dragons from your deck, which you can then use to discard for pressure, bring back another monster, ideally go into your entire play, so you'd have to go into your Grounder, then bring back your home run hitter, have the field spell out. It is quite a heavy card investment combo, but if you do draw the entire combo, this deck can just OTK out of nowhere. And again, we're in OTK meta, so the good OTK decks are going to stand out as being the strongest. I do think this deck is actually really, really strong. I think I'm going to bump this up into the middle of tier 2. I think this is actually where this belongs, and I would not have foreseen this personally. I do think Dragonic Pressure was always an option this deck could have had, but I do think it was a little bit high roll, a little bit too high roll before, but now this is working. We have seen this getting tournament results. We have seen Baseball get its first tournament win, and in that same tournament it had a top 4 finish as well. In the most recent tournament it had a top 8, and the one before even another top 8. This deck is consistent now. It does seem to be relatively powerful in the current metagame, and I think right now this deck should not be underestimated. Then we kind of come down to the other decks. I don't really know where to put a lot of these. I think realistically, I would probably bump Cyber Dragon and Psychic down. But again, realistically, if we're talking about the current actual tournament metagame, it's these 6 decks. These 6 decks are the only decks really worth talking about. The rest of these decks are fine. You'll see them in tournaments occasionally. You'll see them on ladder occasionally. But they are a significant step down from the top 3 tiers. I think overall, Join Tech has been standing out. It's actually been quite powerful. I think Royal Rebel probably moves down a little bit. The deck is still able to do a lot of things. It just really needs to high roll. It can rely on what your opponent's doing as well. So whenever you're playing a deck that relies your opponent to play a specific way, it can get a little bit awkward, unless like you draw like a custom hand effectively. And then Dark Galaxy Fusion is doing okay. It did again get a little bit of a buff on the latest list, and it has been performing reasonably well. I actually might put this to the top of High Rogue. But I do think this deck has been doing a little bit better, with Corridor now back at 2 copies, so I do think this is actually pretty good. But saying that, again, I think realistically, Light Galaxy is just the best deck in the game by quite a bit. It is just so powerful. All the tier 2 decks are competent. They're all capable. I think they all could win tournaments. 2 of them already have won tournaments. They're just not going to be beating Light Galaxy more often. They're going to lose to it. Then the tier 3 decks, these are decks that I would expect to see top 8, maybe top 4 finishes, maybe not winning tournaments quite so much. Again, I still think Red Boot has the potential. You just need to get lucky a lot of the time. And if you do, it's going to be really powerful. If you're not, not. But I would love to hear about your opinions down in the comments. Please tell me which decks you really like at the moment, which ones you really don't. Do you think there's a deck that should have been higher up on the tier list or further down on the tier list? Like, I would imagine a lot of people are probably going to have some disagreements about Chrysaor and my putting it in tier 2. Maybe some people don't think that Red Boot should be in tier 3. I would love to hear about that down in the comments. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.